What up, everybody? It's Bless My Set, and we back at the Mastermind Academy. Today, we got a special video. This is about to be a lecture on the introduction of the philosophy of religion. Now, for those who don't know what the philosophy of religion is, basically, it's just analyzing philosophy in a structured way. We're going to categorize each religion in a certain way and structure the belief systems within that religion. It's a more philosophical, logical way to look at religion instead of just looking at religion from the inside. You really look at religion from the outside and structure it in a systematic way. So, enough talking, man. Let's go ahead and get into this video, guys.
Welcome back to a little bit of philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 3, Lecture 2, an overview of the philosophy of religion. In this short video, we'll introduce the main philosophical puzzles investigated in this subdiscipline of metaphysics. As we learned in an earlier video, there are many different problems investigated in the subdiscipline of academic philosophy known as metaphysics. Metaphysics is, of course, the philosophical investigation into the nature of ultimate reality. Pick any phenomenon in the universe you want and ask why or what, and you're on your way to doing metaphysics. And one of the things humans have spent a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and even fighting about is religion. So naturally, philosophers are interested in understanding this phenomenon that has occupied so much of our time and energy over the millennia. But the philosophy of religion is not really an investigation into the religions of the world. That would fall to the disciplines of cultural anthropology or religious studies. The philosophy of religion is focused on a set of problems that are universal to all religions, not the specific rituals and dogmas of an individual or particular religious system. Now, there are four main problems that compose this metaphysical subdiscipline, starting with an analysis of the nature of divinity itself. People talk about God all the time, but very rarely do you hear a discussion of what exactly they're talking about. Everyone just seems to assume that when they're talking about God, everyone is talking about the same thing. When you do get around to asking someone to be more specific about what they mean by God, things get very diverse very quickly. This, in turn, can lead to equivocation, misunderstanding, and confusion generally. So the first order of business is to get clear on exactly what we mean when we use the word God. Once we've clarified exactly what we mean by the term God, we could then move on to the ontological status of that idea. Is there some existing entity that corresponds to the definition we've agreed to? It's entirely possible for us to know what would be true of God if it exists, and it's another thing entirely to know that God exists. For example, I can know what a dragon is without knowing that there are any dragons. Now, if we establish that God exists, or even provide arguments that demonstrate merely that it's rational to believe that God exists, we can move on to the next major problem in the philosophy of religion, the problem of evil. Now, there's nothing inherently contradictory about the idea of God and the idea of evil, but depending on God's relationship to the universe, a problem may arise. For example, if God is supposed to be the cause of the universe, and if God is supposed to be good by nature, then we have a problem. Why does evil exist in the world? Of course, we'll have to clarify more specifically what evil is, and we'll have to establish that evil, in fact, exists. But given all that, we might very well have a problem that needs to be explained. The final core problem in the philosophy of religion has to do with the nature of religious belief. Now, we've already examined epistemology, and we know that there are rules that govern believing and knowing. So, do the ordinary rules of epistemology apply to religious belief? If not, what are the rules that do apply to faith? As we have limited time in this class, we're going to focus on the first two questions, and we'll begin with an analysis of the concept of divinity. If we're going to talk meaningfully about God, if we're going to propose arguments concerning God's ontological status, we must first have a clear conception of what we're talking about. What exactly does it mean for something to be divine? For example, if we were traveling through the universe and we encountered a being that claimed to be God, how would we test the legitimacy of their claim? We would first need to know what properties or qualities a divine being must have in order to be divine. This is something that philosophers have considered almost from the beginning of the philosophical revolution. And over time, several competing definitions have arisen. We're going to examine the four most compelling definitions of God, starting with the one we call theism, or the three-o-God. Generally speaking, when we think of a divine being, we're thinking of a being with agency. That means it must have the ability to affect change in the world. We call the ability to affect change power. So a divine being must be a being with power. Now, normally, we might differentiate beings by their degree of power. But in this case, it really seems to be more of a qualitative distinction as opposed to merely a quantitative one. It's not enough to have some power, nor is it enough to have lots of power, not even enough to have the most power. In order to qualify as divine, a being would need to be perfectly powerful. We use the word omnipotent to refer to a perfectly powerful being. But what does that actually mean? If a being is omnipotent, does that mean that they can do anything? Could such a being make a burrito so hot even she couldn't eat it? Well, of course, the answer is no, and for several reasons. But the most important reason is that it's a poorly formed question in the first place, because it turns on an ambiguity in the term anything. Omnipotent does not mean the ability to do anything, full stop. It means having the ability to do anything that can be done. Since contradictions are impossible, omnipotence would not apply to contradictions. So theism defines God as a being that has the ability to do anything that does not imply a contradiction, or, to put it positively, anything that can be done. The second necessary property a divine being must have, according to theism, is omniscience. Just as with omnipotence, omniscience does not mean knowing the answer to every question full stop, but rather knowing every true proposition, and of course by inference therefore every false proposition. There are just some questions that are poorly formed and therefore have no answer. For example, what is the largest number? This is a syntactically correct interrogative in the English language, but it's a meaningless question since it fails to understand the nature of numbers. Since numbers are infinite, there is no largest number, and so there can be no largest number in order to be known. It's simply not a thing that can be known. So, according to theism, God must be perfect in power and perfect in knowledge, having no limitation in the ability to do what can be done, and no lack in knowing what can be known. Now, if God has perfect power, and if God has perfect knowledge, then God's actions will be done perfectly. God can't fall short in either ability or intention. But this brings us to the next necessary property of divinity according to theism. Omnibenevolence is being perfectly morally good or perfectly reliable. When we think about the nature of morality, we discover the idea or concept of reliable or reliability. A moral person is a reliable person. Alternatively, an immoral person is an unreliable person. But what makes a person immoral? There are two clear ways a person might fall short of our expectations for their behavior. Either one, they fail to have the ability to perform what we expect them to perform, or two, they fail to have the knowledge of doing what they should do. In other words, immorality is the product of a lack of either power or knowledge, or perhaps a combination of the two. But since God is both perfectly knowledgeable and perfectly powerful, God cannot fail to do that which God intends to do. Hence, God is perfectly morally reliable, a perfect moral agent. God's moral reliability brings us to the final necessary property of divinity according to theism. God is a social being, a person. Morality is a quality of social interaction. Morality, like justice, exists within a social nexus, and that requires personhood. The theist conceives of God as a social being, a personal being, a being who is lovingly engaged with the universe. This is an essential property of God since, according to theism, God is not only responsible for causing the universe, but also caring for and overseeing the universe. If God intervenes in the universe, if there's a miracle, in other words, then it's because God is personally engaged in the destiny of the universe, and that, in turn, requires that God be a person. But what exactly is the nature of personhood? This is a question that requires far more time to examine than we have in this short video. So let's just say that whatever qualities are necessary for a being to be a person, God, according to theism, has that set of qualities. We can now see why the God of theism is sometimes called the Three-O God. God must be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. But what about omnipresent? Isn't God everywhere too? Actually, omnipresence is not a necessary quality of God, according to theism. That's not to say that there aren't some theists who might use this term, but there are a couple of reasons that this is not considered a necessary quality of a divine being in theism. First, omnipresence is often associated, or more precisely confused, with omniscience. How can God know everything? Oh, simple, he's everywhere. But if perfect knowledge is part of God's being, then God does not need to have a causal mechanism by which to acquire knowledge. As finite beings, we need to have proximity to things in order to know them. Our perspective is limited in space and time, so the more access we have, the more knowledge we can get. But God is an infinite being, and therefore does not suffer the limitations of perspective or spatio-temporal acquisition. The second reason omnipresence is not a necessary attribute of God is that theism thinks of God as a transcendent being, a being that is ontologically separate from the observable world. God is eternal, and therefore not in time or in space. God is beyond or separate from the space-time continuum. To be present, even to be present everywhere, would still be to be in time and space. But being eternal, God has no when-ness, and neither does God have location or where-ness. So for theism, God is quite literally nowhere. There are other definitions of God, which we will see in a moment, that do attribute these qualities to divinity, but this is not a necessary component according to theism. Now, the second definition of God we need to consider is closely associated with theism, but it is still different. Deism begins its analysis of the idea of divinity with the conception of God as supreme or greatest being. Like the theist, the deist holds that God must be omnipotent, since any being that was unable to do things that could, in principle, be done would not fit the conception of a supreme being. Similarly, any being that fails to know something that is knowable would fail to be the greatest possible being. This is why Zeus, if he existed, would fail to be God. If Prometheus can trick Zeus, then there are things that Zeus doesn't know, and that limitation means he cannot be divine. Sure, Zeus might be very powerful, and indeed he might be very knowledgeable, he might even be immortal too, but he's not perfect in power and knowledge, and therefore not properly conceived of as a divine being. So if the deist agrees with the theist that God is omnipotent and omniscient, what's the difference between these two views? The difference comes in the consideration of divinity as a social being, a moral being who cares about and intervenes in cosmic history to make the universe turn out right. The deist thinks morality does not apply to God, since there are no social relationships between God and the universe. Instead, the deist thinks of God as a perfect creator, applying pure and complete knowledge to pure and complete power to make the perfect creation. Since the cosmos was perfectly created, there's nothing more for God to do than simply dispassionately observe the product of the divine power and knowledge. For the deist, this is the best of all possible worlds, and therefore there's nothing more for God to do. God is dispassionate because there's nothing that lies outside of the divine knowledge, so there are no surprises, good or bad. God knows what's going to happen in the universe, and indeed, what will happen happens because God intends it to happen. Hence, there's nothing to be passionate about. And of course, there are no miracles, because there's nothing that God needs to fix, since nothing can possibly go wrong in the best of all possible worlds. Our third definition of God rejects the transcendence of the divine in favor of immanence. God is not beyond the universe. God is the universe. Derived from the Greek word pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God, pantheism proposes an identity relationship. The universe is divine. Here we find the concept of omnipresence a necessary feature of God, since whereness, or place, is a ubiquitous feature of the universe. Since God is the universe, God will necessarily be everywhere. So too, everything is part of God. Since the universe is the set of everything that exists, then each thing will be an aspect of the whole set. Therefore, since God is the universe, everything will be part of God. Now, there are different forms of pantheism that hold various positions regarding omniscience. You might, for example, think of the universe simply in material terms, and there need not be any form of cosmic cognition at all. On that view, God's knowledge would just be the set of facts that make up the universe, and knowledge of those facts would not be necessary. But one might also think of the universe itself as being conscious. But if that's true, then what is the universe conscious of? If it were conscious of every state of affairs that ever were, or are, or will be, then the universe would be omniscient. But one might also think of the universe being conscious at a level that does not include awareness of all the particular states that make up the universe. Thinking of ourselves as an example, My awareness does not include every fact about my body, and yet my body is part of me. I'm not aware of what my liver is doing at any given moment, let alone am I aware of what a particular cell in my liver is doing. Analogously, God's consciousness, the cosmic consciousness, might be composed of cognitions that do not include awareness of what each and every part of the universe is doing at any particular moment. Our final definition of God is similar to, but distinct from, pantheism. Derived from the Greek mashup pan, en, and theos, it literally means all is in God. Panentheism is the view that holds the material universe is part of God, but God is more than the sum of the parts. Hence, God is both immanent throughout the universe, as well as transcendent of the universe.
This is deep, guys. I didn't know there was two different terms. It looks like there's pantheism, all is God, God is the universe. I remember this. But pantheism is all is in God. I don't even understand this term right here. There's some deep stuff right here, guys.
Pantheists think of the universe as emerging out of God's being, but not exhausting that being. Hence, God is the ground of being.
Wait, wouldn't that... I think that would fall into the category of Christianity, right, guys? Nah, I don't know. I have to actually think about that.
From which all existence arises. Because there's no identity relationship between God and the universe, panentheists usually attribute the traditional properties of omnipotence and omniscience to God. Being fully aware of itself, God would therefore be aware of everything in the universe. Further, since the universe is part of God, God would care for the universe, being an expression or extension of its own being. Panentheism is a kind of blending of theism and pantheism to encompass aspects of both transcendence and immanence in one single view. Now, before we proceed to introduce the various types of arguments for God's existence, we should stop and mention some terms that often come up in discussions of God that are not necessarily useful from a philosophical point of view. You might, for example, hear someone refer to themselves or someone else as a monotheist when discussing religion. But notice how that term is philosophically unhelpful. If I ask someone to define God, and they answer with, well, I'm a monotheist, they haven't told me anything relevant. The question is, what is God? Not how many gods do you believe exist? You can be a monotheist and be a theist, a deist, a pantheist, or even a panentheist. The term monotheism, like the term polytheism, is a term that's used to describe a religious system, not the nature of God itself. These are terms from anthropology and religious studies that are designed to distinguish one religious system from another. They're not designed to elucidate the nature of the divinity worshipped within a particular religious system. Similarly, the term animism is a term used by anthropologists to describe tribal religious systems of a culture that see the natural world as animated by some form of divine spirit or force. But none of these terms are useful if what we want to know is how someone is conceiving of the divine entity itself. So, in the context of the philosophy of religion, we tend to avoid these anthropological terms. Now, very briefly, there are three other terms we do use in the philosophy of religion that will be useful for our discussions. If someone affirms or believes we can know, or that we at least have sufficient rational justification to believe that God exists, we call them a theist. For the person who claims we know, or have rational justification to believe that God does not exist, we use the term atheist. It literally means not a theist. Both the theist and the atheist are making knowledge claims regarding God and the universe. The former is claiming to know that God exists. The latter is claiming to know that God does not exist. But what about the skeptic? What do we call someone who doesn't believe we have sufficient evidence either for or against the existence of God? In the philosophy of religion, we label such a person agnostic, literally a not knower. Understanding the meaning of these terms makes clear something that most people would be shocked to learn. You can be an atheist and also believe in God. The atheist is denying the existence of the three-o God, not the other possible definitions of God. You can technically be an atheist while also being a deist, or a pantheist, or even a panentheist. In fact, historically speaking, philosophers that held those particular views were often socially rejected and castigated as being atheists. Of course, many people will use the term atheist as a blanket term for someone who denies any divine existence. But in the context of philosophy of religion, we tend to use our terms more narrowly to identify the debate between those who argue we know that the theistic God does or does not exist. And that's how we'll be using the terms in our discussions. Now, to wrap up our introduction of the philosophy of religion, we need to briefly introduce the different kinds of arguments that have been put forward by theists to demonstrate or justify belief that the three-o God exists. Now, there are literally thousands of individual arguments for God's existence, but fortunately, we can organize them together into a few general types or families. As we'll see in a later video, an ontological argument is an argument that attempts to demonstrate a priori that the idea of God entails the existence of God. That is, as we explore the very concept of God, we discover that existence is just another necessary property, and it's just as necessary as omniscience or omnipotence. The most famous version of this type of argument was put forward by St. Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century of the Common Era. We can see an a posteriori approach to proving God's existence in the famous cosmological argument of St. Thomas Aquinas. Arguments that fall under this heading begin with an observation of some fact about the universe, like motion, or even the fact of the universe's existence itself, and then infer that the ultimate cause of that observable effect must be God. There are actually a number of different variations of the cosmological argument that we will examine from St. Anselm's version of the cosmological argument. Closely related to the cosmological argument is the teleological argument, which begins with an observation of the order that we observe in the universe, and then proceeds to argue that that order is actually a kind of design. Since design requires an intentional agent, there must be an intentional agent responsible for the design that we observe. Teleological arguments are the most common form of proof offered for the existence of God and still are very much used today by theists, but by far the most famous was proposed by William Paley in the 19th century. There's another set of arguments that rest on what we might call religious experience. As with cosmological and teleological arguments, these will be a posteriori, as they depend on observable facts about the world to secure our inference to God's existence. In this case, the observable facts are either anthropological or psychological in nature. It's simply a fact that religion is a near ubiquitous human experience. Anthropologists have discovered that religion seems to be a common feature of human culture throughout human history. Given that religious practice is common to human culture, might not this be evidence for the existence of the object of the human activity of worship? This is called a consensus gentium argument. Since everyone acts in a similar fashion, there must be some common reality that is causing that behavior. The more common type of argument from religious experience depends on the subjective experience that is reported across religious systems and cultures that we label mystical. A mystical experience is a direct, subjective encounter or experience of the divine. Those who have had these mystical experiences report their encounters in strikingly similar language, regardless of religious context. Indeed, there are reports from some people who are not even adherents to any particular religion that report having experienced a personal encounter with the divine. The parallels between these cross-cultural psychological experiences, it is argued, is evidence for the existence of God. Now, the final type of argument that we should mention as we wrap up is what we call the moral argument for God's existence. This argument was first put forth by the 18th century German idealist Immanuel Kant. He argued that moral awareness is a product of the structure of reason itself, not entirely unlike our understanding of mathematics, and thus any rational agent will have moral awareness. However, the awareness of morality entails an obligation to act according to the moral dictates of reason, and yet, as a practical matter, humans most often choose to act in ways that are contrary to what our own moral reasoning demands. Kant thinks it would be absurd for the universe to have given rise to beings who are capable of moral awareness, but not having the capacity to fully comply with that awareness. Thus, he concludes there must be at least one being that is capable of consistently fulfilling the moral law, and that's God. In some later videos, we'll look at examples of some of these arguments for God's existence. Specifically, we'll look at an example of an ontological argument, the cosmological argument, as well as the teleological argument for God's existence. But for now, let's summarize what we've covered in this very brief introduction to the philosophy of religion. We've learned that the philosophy of religion is one of the many sub-branches of metaphysics, and that it focuses on providing a philosophical analysis of God, not religion. In this philosophical subdiscipline, there are four main problems that we're trying to resolve. What is the proper way to conceive of God? Can we provide arguments that either demonstrate the existence or at least provide rational justification for belief in the existence of God? If God exists, what is its relationship to the rest of the cosmos? And what is the nature of religious belief? What are the epistemological rules associated with faith? One can find throughout the history of Western philosophy many philosophers advocating for the alternative answers that we've sketched out in this very brief introduction, but we should note that the majority of philosophers in the Western tradition have fallen into the camp of theism, and all of the arguments that we're going to examine coming up are from this perspective. However, it would be rather easy to argue for God's existence if one were simply a pantheist. All you have to do is look outside. Is the universe there? Yep. Well, God exists. Okay, that's all for now. I hope this brief introduction to the philosophy of religion has been helpful.
Listen, guys, that video was so amazing, man. You know, I remember I first learned about this stuff through I think his name was James Hall. The Great Courses. If you guys ever watch The Great Courses, they're like a company, and they got like a whole bunch of DVDs on different, different subjects from history to philosophy to math. And I was watching this lecture series by, I think his name was James Hall, and he had the philosophy of religion. He was breaking down all of these categories, bro. Like, it was he was breaking down omnipotent and omniscient, like the idea that God is all knowing and all powerful, omnibenevolent, that it's hard to say, all loving, you know what I'm saying? Or he broke down the teleological argument, the ontological argument. The teleological argument just means God it has a purpose. There's a purpose in the universe that can point to God, or the ontological argument, which is, what is God's being? You know, is he all good, all powerful, all wise? You know what I'm saying? And you know, even the ideas he was breaking down with the you know, ananism and dynamism. You know, energy coming. Ananism is the energy coming through the, like, animals and stuff like that, or dynamism is the idea that energy comes through objects. You know, so it's like this stuff right here helps you categorize, you know, religion and which ones is, you know, which, you know, and put them all in categories. But the cool thing about this is that it doesn't tell you to choose which religion to believe in. It just structure it in a logical, systematic way, right? You know, you'll have to make that determination on which one is true, whether it's like Christianity or you know, Christianity, or, you know, Islam, or, you know, whatever religion it is, you know what I'm saying? Like Hinduism, you know, like, so it's a good place to learn and start, you know what I'm saying? Before you even dive into the subjective part of religion, the philosophy of religion, studying the structures of the religion before you choose, can be very beneficial. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I love the philosophy of religion. I was loving James Hall's lecture series. Do I got that still? I don't even know if I still got that. You know what I'm saying? But it's something like this, though. You know, I got this right here. Is the it's called the Great Courses series, guys. You know what I'm saying? If I can, yeah, this is like the Great Courses here. This is understanding the New Testament, but they got a philosophy of religion one, and you guys need to check that out, bro. I've been collecting a lot of these from a few psychology ones. Mainly, I got a lot of the philosophy ones because I'm into philosophy. So I was like getting I think I got man, I can't even think about all of the ones that I got, but I've been stacking them all up, bro. I got like 15 of them joints, bro. Maybe I'll make a video going through them joints, man, because them is so fire to me, bro. Like, I got some on, I think, argumentation, debates, some on philosophy, some on religion. I got this one, I remember it was like the cultural religion one, you know what I'm saying? Like, of like, you know, each, they was breaking down each religion and stuff. So, you know, I'm big on lectures and stuff. I love lectures. I need to watch more, but I'm a fan of good lectures. So you guys start at the Great Courses, guys, and then actually you can actually go online, and you don't even have to get the DVDs. Actually, they got a website you guys can go to and then watch all of the videos. You know what I'm saying? And they'll have all of the lectures. You know, but you got to pay for them. You know, those is quality. These is people from, you know, top tier university giving these lectures. You know what I'm saying? So you want to find the truth? Go through those lectures, man. That's where it's at. But hey, man, I appreciate y'all watching this video, man. I think it was very beneficial. Let me know down below if y'all want me to keep commenting keep reacting to these type of videos. I think it's very beneficial. You know what I'm saying? So hey, man, I'm gonna catch y'all next time, man. Peace.